This morning we examined, and actually early this afternoon, we've examined rowing of various eras going back as far as 1936. Now let's go back another 107 years. During the 19th century, Bell's life in London and Sporting Chronicle was the Bible of rowing, reporting, and opinion, covering all matters aquatic for amateurs, a word which literally came into existence during this period to describe lovers of aquatic sport. I think that's all of us. In its year-end summary for 1829, Bell's Life had the following to say about the previous August the 17th. The river presented a scene of animation scarcely if ever equaled in consequence of numerous matches which were announced for that day. Indeed, that singular day would turn out to be arguably the summit that competitive rowing ever reached on the London Tideway. For decline was already in the air. We will examine briefly 6 regattas held on 17 August, but first let us conjure up what the Thames in London actually looked like 188 years ago. Get ready. I'm going to take you on a visual roller coaster. Here's the river as we find it today, with myriad bridges above and tunnels below, an afterthought in a vast urban metropolis more or less 100 yards wide, hemmed in on both sides by artificial embankments that were constructed in the Victorian era. To get a better idea of what the river was like before the embankments, look at this. Did you know that the renowned Venetian landscape master Canaletto actually lived in London between 1746 and 1758? The Thames of his time was a vastly different river, a crowded thoroughfare more than 3 times as wide as today, and bustling with all manner of boats. This photo from last December, blame me, is not quite as nice as Canaletto's, but it's from a vantage point similar to Canaletto's, in front of Somerset House on the Middlesex bank. There are many more bridges limiting our view downstream, but hardly a boat in sight. Only the very top of the dome of St. Paul's Cathedral remains visible, and the forest of Christopher Wren church spires built in the years after the Great London Fire of 1666 have disappeared altogether from view. Look again, seriously. For more than 500 years, the only bridge anywhere on the entire urban tideway was Old London Bridge, built in 1209. You can see it here on the horizon more than a mile away. And look at all the watercraft, including a ceremonial state barge here. Now, this is my first. There. In the middle distance. And look at this, a panoramic view of London and its wide river from the Surrey side, created by Clyce Fisher in 1616, the year that Shakespeare died. In this detail, you can see the pre-fire St. Paul's Cathedral in the background, there, the Globe Theatre in the foreground, there, and Old London Bridge. The principal impact this bridge had on the riverscape came from its numerous piers and starlings, which acted to significantly impede the flow of the formidable London tides as they rose and fell up to 24 feet twice per day, generating fierce currents in either direction. When the tide was running hard and fast under the bridge either way, the height differential of the water on the 2 sides could be as much as 4 or 5 feet, leading to the expression that the bridge was for wise men to pass over and fools to pass under. Let's return to the Canaletto View from Somerset House and a photograph of the Victoria Embankment under construction during the 1860s. The old riverfront would soon disappear under tons of landfill. Just upstream of Somerset House, is the home of immortal 17th century diarist Samuel Pepys. Here. Pepys wrote of his being rowed to work daily by a Thames waterman. He reached the riverfront through the wonderful York Watergate built in 1626 and seen here in the background. Today, it is a gateway no longer to the Thames, but to the Victoria Embankment Gardens. With stairs to nowhere, the river now displaced more than 140 yards away. This painting shows York Watergate as it was intended. Let's return once more to Canaletto. Look again at the wide river and all the boats, the majority powered by oars. And here's a second Canaletto painted from just a few steps further upstream, showing in even greater detail watercraft of all sorts. Working boats, passenger wherries, and again a state barge. And here's a third Canaletto. You can tell I was an art history major. From the same basic vantage point, this time looking upstream towards Westminster Bridge. Here's a close-up of the Middlesex Bank at high tide. I tried counting all the wherries just in this detail. I quit after 40. Note that extending from several access points leading to the river along this reach were floating wooden docks for passenger wherries rowed by licensed watermen, each permanently assigned to that specific named location. This 1829 engraving shows a typical passenger boat the waterman rowed. And here is a replica of the wherry on the far right of the engraving, in the background. To the inhabitants of London since the Middle Ages, watermen and their wherries had been the bridges, buses, cabs, and long-haul lorries of their day. Here is yet another Canaletto view of the Thames. This time from Richmond House, 6/10 of a mile further upstream, and this time while the tide was ebbing. Note the many wherries with their customers, along with more than 2 more state barges proceeding upstream. For more than 800 years, the Lord Mayor of London had been required by charter to annually present himself to the monarch's representative in Westminster, and the procession of the Lord Mayor's state barge has been a high point of the year for all that time, including in 1747 when Canaletto memorialized it. Into the 19th century, the Lord Mayor, the royal family, and heads of many professional guilds still regularly traveled the Thames in ceremonial barges like this one seen at Henley this year. This is worth 10 seconds to just, oh my goodness. So Jack, it's a little slower than it. So we got a very good look. This was built in recent years lovingly by a number of our British wooden boat builders, and it seems to have, will go on. Now let us return to the Richmond House painting and examine the far bank. About 30 yards of mudflat have already been exposed by the receding waters. At least 3 places to board a wherry can be noted. There's one here, and there's at least one over here. With the formerly floating docks now become wooden ramps across the exposed ground to protect gentlemen and ladies from soiling their clothes and shoes in the mud. Other stretches of the river featured paved stone walkways across the flats. These could be very treacherous when wet, and watermen worked endlessly to keep them slime and mud free. Each set of stairs would have had a name familiar to all and shown on all city maps. This embarkation point here was King's Arms Stairs. Here's a 1791 engraving looking across from King's Arms Stairs. You see it? There's stairs right there. To Richmond House, which is right there, where Canaletto had been standing. And here's the entire area on a 1827 map. Somerset House, New York, Watergate, Richmond House, Westminster Bridge, a number of stairs, including King's Arms Stairs. As it had been in the time of Pepys and before, early in the 19th century, the Thames was still the preferred travel route through Georgian London. As depicted here by Thomas Rowlandson, artist, cartoonist, and scathing social critic, London was a traffic nightmare of narrow streets clogged with mud, manure, and coaches. Sounds familiar. This 1807 caricature is aptly titled Miseries of London. What Rowlandson could not portray was the incessant din of horses' hooves and iron wheels on cobblestones. More than once in Charles Dickens' writings of the same period, two characters would meet on a London street and have to retreat up a blind alley to carry on a conversation. By contrast, even with city sewage pouring straight into it, the flowing waters of the River Thames offered welcome respite from the onslaught of clamor and clatter on land. In Chaucer's day, they called the Thames the silent highway. Pubs faced the river rather than the street. At upwards of 100 sets of river stairs in London alone, you could hire a licensed professional to row you in his wherry up, down, or across the Thames in speed and comfort unimaginable on the filthy and congested streets of the city. Let us turn now to the remarkable 1647 panoramic view of London by Wenceslaus Höller. This portion of the river below Bridge was the city harbor, perhaps the busiest port in the world at the time, and referred to as the Pool of London. A further close-up reveals numerous ships tied to piers on both banks, the water being deep enough to keep them from resting on the bottom at low tide. But the two ships anchored in midstream chose to employ licensed lightermen to row their flat-bottom barges, or lighters, up to them and offload their cargoes by hand, thereby avoiding pier fees. That task completed, the lightermen would then transfer out from shore English goods bound for ports around the world. This Rowlandson watercolor gives some sense of the concentration of industry in the Pool of London. A lighter in the foreground, a ship beached at low tide to allow for work to proceed on its hull, other ships at anchor far enough from the bank to continue floating at low tide. This 1812 Rowlandson caricature, also titled Miseries of London, and you could look at this for 10 minutes. Oopsie. You could look at this for 10 minutes and find all sorts of interesting details. Shows a similar view across the pool in its background. Rowlandson identifies the specific location he was portraying as Wapping, Wapping Old Stairs, which can be found, if I point correctly, right here on this 1827 map. Now let's briefly review some of the aquatic activity on 17 August 1829, perhaps the busiest day of rowing competition in Urban's Thames Tideway history, before or since. Though it would rain the rest of the week, it was cloudy that Monday. At noon, the temperature stood at 61 degrees, the barometer at 30.02 and falling. As we shall discover, regattas of that era needed to be run during high water. High tide at London Bridge on that afternoon of 17 August took place at 6 minutes past 4, ideal for a competition that might begin around 2 p.m. and end around 6. Sunset on the 17th was at 7:18. So all the regattas that took place on the river that day occurred virtually simultaneously. Two of the contests took place in the Pool of London. We will first examine the St. John and St. George's Regatta, annual contest for a wherry and other prizes given by the inhabitants of St. John Wapping and St. George's in the east. Here are the two churches today. And here on the 1827 map. That is St. John and St. George's is up here. 6 professional watermen from the neighborhood, 3 from Wapping Old Stairs. We've already pointed this one out. And this is a watercolor of it. And 3 from Wapping New Stairs, which is right here. With another watercolor. These 6 individuals were invited to participate and compete for the prizes. So why would the inhabitants of a neighborhood sponsor a regatta for their local watermen? There were several reasons. By the 1820s, watermen were beginning to fall on hard times. On the upstream side of Old London Bridge, Westminster, Blackfriars, Vauxhall, Waterloo, and Suffolk bridges were already in place, allowing citizens to walk rather than be rowed across the Thames. Worse, steam-powered launches were beginning to compete with oar-powered wherries, a fight that watermen were bound to lose. The handwriting was on the wall. An annual regatta with a valuable wherry and cash prizes was a way for the community to financially support and encourage the watermen that they relied upon to continue to work their stairs in their community. The prize-wary often had an elaborately painted backboard, which is right behind you all. This particular one, which is from 1852 and on display here at the River and Rowing Museum. These worries were worth as much as a year's pay to a waterman supporting his family, and the backboard would be perfect advertising for him in the years that followed. But that's not all. Regattas were occasions for raucous street carnivals, attracting enormous crowds and bringing huge business to local shops, pubs, street vendors, and performers. Here's the description of a typical regatta written in 1835 by none other than Charles Dickens. A well-contested rowing match on the Thames is a very lively and interesting scene. The water is studded with boats of all sorts, kinds, and descriptions. Places in the coal barges at the different wharves are let to crowds of spectators. Beer and tobacco flow freely about. Men, women, and children wait for the start in breathless expectation. Cutters of 6 and 8 oars glide gently up and down, waiting to accompany their protégés during the race. And bands of music add to the animation, if not to the harmony of the scene. This Rollinson watercolor captures well the atmosphere. Incidentally, one of the 6-oared cutters mentioned by Dickens might well have been the cutter Leander. The club was but 17 years old in 1835. One more thing, besides being exciting and entertaining, rowing contests were an ideal occasion to place wagers. Gambling was the obsession of George in London, and bookmakers were everywhere in regatta days, adjusting the odds as the racing progressed. Betting was intense, often amounting to thousands of pounds. And the contestants, often referred to as wagermen, were well known to the onlookers. For years, members of the community had entrusted their very lives to them daily, getting to know them while sitting face to face with them in their wherries. How natural it was to relate to them personally and support them by placing bets on their success. Dickens continues. Here they are, is the general cry, and through darts the first boat, the men in her stripped to the skin and exerting every muscle to preserve the advantage they have gained. 4 other boats follow close astern, there not being 2 boats' length between them. The shouting is tremendous, the interest intense. Every little public house fires its gun and hoists its flag. And the men who win the heat come in amidst a splashing and shouting and banging and confusion which no one can imagine who has not witnessed it, and of which any description would convey a very faint idea. So wrote Charles Dickens. Briefly, here is how the competition at the 1829 St. John and St. George's Regatta went. The 6 men competed in 2 heats of 3 each. The victors qualified directly to the final. The remaining 4 went out again in a 3rd heat, what we would call a repechage now. The winner of that joining the victors of the first 2 heats in a 4th and final 3-boat heat. The locale used for this regatta was an open corridor of water between the riverbank and boats anchored in midstream. You get some sense of what this looked like from this contemporary photo of the Putney embankment. Anchor any closer to land and you're hung up at low tide. The result is an avenue of clear water on each side of the river during periods of high tide, forming perfect venues for rowing competitions. On 17 August 1829, each heat was contested in full sight of the gathering crowd, beginning at Union Stairs. Let's see. And we'll get a little closer here. Beginning at Union Stairs, going around King Edward Stairs, back to Union Stairs, King Edward Stairs, and the end. Altogether, 2.25 miles with 380-degree turns. Did I do that too many times? Anyway, 3 turns, extremely treacherous to negotiate in close competition. Think of the Ben-Hur chariot race. During the afternoon of 17 August, the winner would have had to negotiate this course at least twice to earn his victory. In heavy working wherries, that was a ton of exertion. At the end, all the wagermen were towed the length of the course to receive the accolades of the assembled crowd. 5 of the 6 received generous prizes. The second regatta we will examine took place on the opposite bank of the Pool of London, St. Olave's Regatta for a prize wherry. Returning to a detail from a polychrome copy of Vischer, here is St. Olave's. And here on the 1827 map. The racing took place between 6 watermen belonging to Battersea Bridge stairs, which is right there. They followed the same scheme of 4 heats as the previous regatta, beginning off Chamberlain's Wharf, adjacent to St. Olaf's, here, right there, going down, let's see, going down to George's Stairs, which is at this end, Battle Bridge, George's Stairs, and finishing at Battle Bridge. Total of 1.32 miles with 3 180-degree turns. At the conclusion of the regatta, the wherry with its winner aboard was conveyed round the parish on the shoulders of the winner's supporters, many of whom had probably won healthy sums of betting upon his prowess. The third regatta we will discuss is the 9th annual Lambeth Regatta for a prize wherry given by the ladies and gentlemen of St. Mary, Lambeth. This church, along with the Lambeth Palace and Gardens, residence of the Archbishop of Canterbury, still exists today. Unfortunately, just about every other trace of the Lambeth of 1829 is gone, disappeared behind the Albert Embankment and beneath St. Thomas's Hospital. Here is a view of the palace and church from the phenomenal Panorama of the Thames published by Samuel Lee. This astonishing book shows in detail how both sides of the river looked in our year of 1829, all the way from Westminster Bridge upstream to Richmond. This particular portion showing Battersea Bridge and its environs. Turn it over to see the different shorelines. Altogether, 15 miles of river on both banks, with in one continuous strip, more than 60 feet in length, neatly folded between its covers. We will turn to this incredible resource several more times this afternoon. Let us return to Lambeth and focus on the area between the Palace and Westminster Bridge, which over the years has received a great deal of attention from rowing historians since Leander Club came into being in this location around 1818. The club will be celebrating its 200th anniversary next year. This 1827 detail shows the river between Westminster and Vauxhall Bridges, that's on the left, and in a further close-up at right, you can clearly see the church and the palace at the bottom, here. And there are 2 neighborhoods. Between the gardens and the river is Bishop's Walk, and between the gardens and Westminster Bridge Road is Stangate. During the 19th century, the entire riverfront of both locales was dominated by Searle boat builders, along with other oar and boat makers, and numerous sheds for rental boats and state barges. Here's a map from the Brilliance, the 1997 Leander Club history, showing various Searle properties and Leander locations. Let's examine Stangate first. Here's the view from the 1829 Panorama, another circa 1840 from Thomas Rowlandson, and three views painted by Richard Pembrey around 1851. Count 1 state barge. I'll let you do the counting from here. Now 3. There's 1 over on the left. And again 3 in this version. The Bishop's Walk area also was a jumble of boat sheds and boat builders. Around 1830, Searles expanded beyond their downstream Stangate yard to several properties along Bishop's Walk, including the first meeting rooms for a Leander Club, shown here under the Searle sign in a print from around 1831. This photo shows Bishop's Walk with the Palace Garden wall on the left. This is the view that members of Leander would have had as they arrived to meet and to take to their boats. The sign on the third house reads, it's hard to read here, E. Searle, boat builder, boats let and housed. This row of 5 attached houses is clearly shown here on this detail of the map from the Brilliance. The Lambeth Regatta on 17 August involved 12 watermen assigned to Lambeth Stairs, directly in front of the Church of St. Mary. The men rowed 6 wherries as pairs, in 2 heats of 3 each, the 2 winning boats advancing to the 3rd and final heat. Starting from Westminster Bridge, they rowed upstream, round a boat moored off the 9 Elms, returning down the Surrey bank, round Carey's floating bath, then back to Lambeth Stairs, around 3.2 miles, with 280-degree turns. This 1820 map shows a village named 9 Elms, but the turnaround was probably in front of a nearby tavern of that name, likely near Cumberland Gardens. Here. Carey's floating bath. Here's an engraving of another floating bath nearby from 1874. I'd go to one of those. Earlier in the century, Carey's floating bath was moored off the downstream end of the pier of Westminster Bridge, close to the Surrey bank, just a bit past the left, going that way, of this print. So it was possible actually to row around it, which is what they did. Here's an image of the interior of a floating bath. They were very popular. As we proceed further upstream on 17 August 1829, the regattas were no longer about supporting neighborhood watermen, but were about providing challenging contests upon which gentlemen could wager. The next regatta took place at the Red House, an inn and pub located in the Surrey countryside. And it was located basically right across from Chelsea College. 12 landsmen, in other words, members of the artisan class, who were not watermen and therefore hard for bookmakers to handicap, competed in 6 wherries rowed as pairs. No description of the course or the results survives, but here's a depiction of a similar contest from 1826, competitors in 4 pairs, passing the Red House, shadowed by 2 cutters and a steam launch. The next contest from 17 August took place in the village of Battersea. Let's again orient ourselves with our modern map, and now widen the view. Upstream of Vauxhall Bridge, which is here, is Battersea. Let's see. Yeah, above that is Chelsea on the one side, and the Red House would have been around here. We get to Battersea Bridge, and around the corner was Battersea Village. Here's Battersea Bridge in 1874. Note the mudflats on both banks at low tide. This painting is by Walter Greaves, a Thames waterman who was one of the first pupils of the artist James Whistler. That indeed may be Whistler striding over the bridge in this Greaves watercolor. All we know of the race held here on 17 August 1829 is that 4 landsmen competed starting from Old Swan Tavern, Battersea. Next to the Old Swan was St. Mary's Church, which still stands, though the village atmosphere disappeared long ago. In the 1960s, there was a pub called the Old Swan on the original site. That's what it says. But today, even that has been gone for decades. The last regatta we will examine took place in Wandsworth, the next village upstream from Battersea on the Surrey bank. Back to our modern map. Battersea Bridge, Battersea, Wandsworth is over here. 8 wherries rowing as pairs, each with 1 waterman and 1 landsman, again hard to handicap, competed in 2 heats of 4 each. The top 2 in each met in the final heat for the prize. The race stayed directly in front of the town, beginning at the White Horse Tavern, round a boat moored off Wandsworth Creek, and you can still spot Wandsworth Creek today. At the upstream end of town, back to a boat moored off Carter Hythe, here, at the downstream end of town, then returning to the White Horse. Each heat went 3 times round for a total of 2.64 miles and a challenging 680-degree turns. Though we have no reports of regattas, they didn't have repechages in that one. That would have been tough. Though we have no reports of regattas further upstream of Wandsworth on 17 August 1829, I would be remiss if our visual journey did not continue one more mile and visit Putney. Here's a 1793 watercolor looking downstream of the villages of Fulham on the left and Putney on the right. The churches on either side can still be seen today. In 1829, various pubs in Putney were popular destinations for amateurs, notably including the Leander six-oared cutter, which would regularly row the more than 5 miles up from Lambeth, partake of a sumptuous repast, and return in the evening. A favorite pub amongst rowers was the Eight Bells, and a pub of that name exists today across in Fulham. Back in Putney, another favorite was the Star and Garter. Got bigger with time. And then it got a whole lot bigger. Oops, sorry. Didn't mean to do that. It carries on today, sadly, with any evidence of rowing removed. There was also the Duke's Head, once at the far upstream end of Putney with only open countryside beyond. While today you walk past a grander Duke's Head to the row of boathouses that were added beginning in the middle of the 19th century. In the years since 1829, Putney has become ever more important to rowers. As metropolitan London grew and grew, the urban Thames Tideway became increasingly less amenable to rowing, with steam-powered boats further chopping up its waters and embankments hemming it in. As bridges proliferated and roads improved, Thames watermen lost their livelihoods. Professional rowing competitions withered and died, and amateur rowing moved inexorably upstream to escape the degradation. Today, the Putney Embankment is home to numerous boat clubs, and Putney Bridge serves as the start line of the annual Oxford-Cambridge boat race. In the mid-19th century, the construction of the Albert Embankment forced Leander Club to abandon its birthplace in Lambeth, and for several decades it resided in Putney, before migrating even further upstream to its current location in Henley, just a short walk from where we have gathered today. This concludes our visual journey along the Thames Tideway of 1829, but I do hope that each of you is now motivated to take one of the regular ferries that travel the Thames between the Pool of London and Putney. Those amongst you with the sharpest of eyes will spot the occasional set of stairs. Yes, some have survived. Here is Wapping Old Stairs, today a site for urban archaeologists, but watch yourself, it has been a very long time since an apprentice waterman has kept these steps slime-free. And hopefully those amongst you with the sharpest of imaginations will squint your eyes and see again for yourselves the Thames Tideway as it once looked in 1829. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.